Thanks for being here. This is great. It's terrific. In person. Really excited about this. I'm Dave Warren with Source Financial, and I get the lucky job of introducing our speaker for today. Source Financial, we are a supporter of ONtrac and the presenting sponsor for today's seminar and for the lunch today. So, Marsha Davis will be presenting the business case for racial equity. Marsha is the founder of Davis Squared Consulting and also the executive director of the Zedek Social Justice Fund. Marsha believes deeply in the power of community to create positive change and equitable environments. She first dove into social justice as an educator working to inspire students of color to pursue science in college. She graduated from Harvard University with a BA in molecular and cellular biology and earned an MA in teaching. She transitioned to nonprofit administration to broaden her impact on social justice movements. Marsha has more than a decade of experience as an educator, administrator, and racial equity consultant. In her capacity at Davis Squared Consulting, she works with organizations to create equitable internal cultures. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Marsha Davis.
Thank you, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. Well, here's the thing that it's really amazing to be back here in person, actually speaking about racial equity. Face. Some of you may remember we were here in 2019 talking about redlining, and so much has happened since then. Chances are you all have gone through, similar growth process that I think the whole nation has gone through in the last few years. And I would say, especially in the last week, being a DEI practitioner has been really difficult. The murders in Buffalo, I have to be honest and say that hit me really hard, both as an individual and as a practitioner. You kind of get to this moment where you think, wait, we're doing all of this work just for an 18-year-old to decide he's going to kill 10 people at once. And so we're going to speak a little bit about, that of course will come up, because I think there's no way I could, in good conscience, not mention that at some point, or have us talk through that a little bit at some point in this work. But what was more, and so what you'll notice is I had this talk, business case for racial equity, and I thought I was just going to jump into finances and numbers, and let's talk about what we can financially get from going into the racial equity work. But I can't, again, when we're seeing what's going around us, to kind of dive just into the numbers and what we financially gain from racial equity would be in some way, I felt, dishonoring to the lives that we've lost throughout this process. So yes, we'll talk about the business case for racial equity, but I'll tell you that kind of in my, as I was prepping for this, the informal title that I had in my brain is how to keep white people engaged in dismantling white supremacy when the diversity trainings are not enough, right? So, about how to keep us engaged. Because the reality is, a lot of us have jumped into this work since the murder of George Floyd in 2020, right? And there was a surge in interest. And I'll tell you right now, I'm already seeing it as an equity consultant and just as a Black person, that people have stopped caring, right? You were kind of like, oh, we did a lot for 2 years, isn't that beautiful? But if you're going to be engaged in this work, and if you completely understand the systems of white supremacy and racism and how they work in our country, you please must know that this is a multi-generational struggle, right? This didn't start in 2020. It's not going to end in 2022. So if you thought this was a 2-year engagement, be ready for something more. And hopefully this will inspire you to keep staying in the game. So let's get started by just getting on the same page around vocabulary. I'm imagining that I'm hoping actually that a lot of you in the last 2 years at least have done some DEI trainings, you've heard people talk to you about racial equity, talk to you about what those terms may mean. But what I've seen that actually has emerged in my work is that we all have these slightly different definitions, right? And it makes it kind of hard for us to get on the same page and have the same conversation. So what I want to introduce you to are actually what I use as guiding questions when I'm trying to apply these terms, right? Because I find that whenever I work with clients, sometimes people get hung up on, wait, which definition of diversity are we using? Do I put the comma here? And it's like, that's not really what's important, right? When you're applying these concepts, here's some guiding questions that I want you to keep in mind. So when we're thinking about diversity, the guiding question for that work that you're usually have in mind is who is in the room? And for inclusion, it's whose voice is in the room, whose voice is heard in the room. Now, when I was growing up, and partially in Oklahoma's America, things were a little different. And folks were kind of telling me that being colorblind was really the way to go. Thinking about diversity and inclusion was enough for us to really deal with a lot of the inequities that we have in our culture today. The reality is, and we've seen often enough, that these things are not enough. They're beautiful goals in and of themselves, but they're not the practices that are really going to lead us to the equitable democracy that we all long for. Here's why. Diversity is a beautiful question, asking who is in the room. And if you look at these two pictures, really the level of diversity, the rates of diversity in those two pictures are approximately the same at face value, right? Assuming that when you look at someone, you can tell what their race and ethnicity is. About the same. But can anyone identify what might be the difference in these two pictures? I heard a voice, yes? Power. Can you say more about that?
There is a clear power differential.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I feel like I kind of planted her in the audience. Power differential, right? I mean, just asking who is in the room tells you nothing about the experiences of people in the room. The majority of large businesses in the South during the time of chattel slavery were about, 95% African American at that point? Enslaved Africans of all different ethnicities. About 5% indentured servitude, Eastern Europeans. Now those are the kind of numbers that if I presented them to you today and put the name of Truist on top, you would say, wow, that's a highly diverse organization. That's a really highly diverse business, right? Plantations, highly diverse businesses, right? But that tells you nothing about the experiences of the people in this space, right? So if you're just doing that based on numbers, that's not enough. So we've moved on kind of to inclusion. I think a lot of people here look like they're similarly aged, and so we probably went through the same process in terms of understanding racial equity work, where you went from, okay, diversity is what we're focusing on, now we're focusing on inclusion. And the guiding question is whose voice is heard in the room? Again, beautiful goal. Inclusion is involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized. Beautiful. Yet, power is still hoarded in the hands of those who have dominant identities, right? So it's still, someone with a dominant identity gets to decide which voices do we listen to. And it's beautiful that you listen to them. I'm thinking about focus groups. I'm thinking about ways that you invite community members to just bring in their public input in a session. And that's typically where many organizations kind of start and stop their DEI work, is just thinking about, well, let's get some voices into the space, let's collect them in a report, let's bring it to our board. And yet the reality is that the people who still have the power to make decisions about what's going on in that organization still have those dominant identities. So we haven't shifted a lot. So these days, what I'm pushing us towards is to really focus on racial equity, not just diversity and inclusion. And to see diversity and inclusion as actually symptoms of racial equity, right? And thinking about the definition of equity that I like to use actually came from Tamiko Ambrose of Ambrose Consulting and Marisol Jimenez of Tepeyax Consulting, who are both local consultants. And their definition is equity is both the process and the result of practices that directly address historical, pervasive, and persistent inequities through the transformative redistribution of power and a deep commitment to restorative justice. That's a definition of racial equity as a journey. And also when you think about it as a destination, it's the condition where race does not determine or predict the distribution of resources, opportunities, and burdens. Contrary to what many of us have been taught, colorblind policies don't lead to racial equity, right? racial equity comes through acknowledging the inequities that have been baked into our systems from the beginning and addressing those. So the guiding question I usually use when I'm thinking about racial equity work is who has the power to determine what happens in the room? Not just who's in the room, not just whose voices are we listening to, but who actually gets to make those decisions, right? Part of the reason it's important for us to stay focused on racial equity and not just diversity inclusion is actually really related. I think a perfect example of it is the talk that we did in the before times, pre-COVID times, the redlining talk, right? Where we talked about this redlining map here of Asheville as a case study for how housing discrimination has been baked into our governmental policies for years, since the dawn of this country. And when you look at this redlining map, it's important to remember that this was a map actually created by the Federal Housing Administration, right? A governmental body. This red area is downtown Asheville, that was predominantly Black at the time of this study. And essentially this map is indicating to folks who are providing home loans where you should not provide home loans, right? And so using this map, the majority of white Americans were given access to home ownership, which is access to generational wealth and has all these other implications. And then Black people, immigrants, Jews actually as well, were systemically left out of this opportunity to build wealth. And so I'm bringing this map back up to help us remember when we think about some of these systemic issues that have been causing these racial inequities in our country. These issues don't get eliminated by diversity initiatives or inclusion initiatives, right? They get eliminated by racial equity initiatives. Initiatives that actually ask us to shift and share power more equitably with all the different stakeholders in our community, right? But just like you, I've done a lot of growing in the last few years. And I've seen this pattern emerge over and over and over again with the racial equity consulting that I do with different organizations. Folks will come in and say, yes, we're really into this concept of racial equity. Okay. And then I do this training, and they're like, yes, I'm in. And then I ask the question, who has the power to determine what happens in the room? And they say, it should be all of us. Great. And then we get to the piece where we want to go from theory to action, and there's almost like a physical constriction in your body, right? Especially if you're the person in the room who's been holding power, and especially if you also have dominant identities. Right? I find that as I've been doing this work, that the white people who hear this question constrict physically, whereas the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the BIPOC folks in the room, feel some sort of relief. Like their shoulders are released down from their ears, because they're like, oh God, finally someone's talking about it. The amount of times I've been in this organization, I'm trying to explain, yes, you did put a Black person on that committee, but you didn't give them any decision-making power. Yes, you did listen to, impoverished folks or unhoused folks. But when it came down to actually make a decision, the board decided to think about their budget instead of those inclusive voices, right? And I've been really curious over the last few years, what is going on with this constriction that people feel? Even when they say they have the intentions and their heart is in the right place, and then it comes down to do the work. And I'm asking myself, what is happening? What's that physical response? Where did it come from? And I want to actually take a moment and have you take about a few seconds and just feel in your body. Close your eyes if you don't feel comfortable, or lower your eyes to the ground. And as I ask this question, I want you to just notice what's going on in your body. Who has the power to determine what happens in the room? We need to share power with those who are most impacted by the oppressions that we hope to end. Great, whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. Now, I'm not going to ask you to be super vulnerable in this space yet. And so you don't quite have to share what you've experienced, right? But I just want to share for you what I've seen among my clients. That there's this unspoken barrier to racial equity, even for folks who say that they're deeply invested in it. And the unspoken barrier is this internal cultural narrative of fear and racial resentment. I see it over and over again, but it usually doesn't come up as people saying, wow, I'm really scared that if I invest in racial equity, there will no longer be a place for me. No one usually says it like that, but here's how I put that. How many more concessions do they want us to make? Literally a quote from racial equity work that I've done at the school, where a white mother said, yes, I hear what you're saying about BIPOC folks in our community being traumatized, but how many more concessions do they want us to make? And when I hear that, my initial thought was like, concessions? How many concessions have we made? And the word concessions is interesting in the sense of like, it assumes that you own the space, and that when BIPOC people are asking for access, you get to still own the space and make concessions, as opposed to remembering that they are also people who pay tuition and pay property taxes that then lead to education. It's their school too. Right? But when I get over that initial angry reaction, I realize, oh my gosh, this is a white mom who's really worried about what's going to happen to her child. She's scared. Here's how it also comes out. You just want to make a world where black people get everything. That's not what MLK fought for. He fought for us to be colorblind. No, he didn't, actually. I just want to check that, if that was there in your mind. If you actually read any of his speeches, right? He consistently talks about the plight of the Negro, right? Not the plight of the population of people who are accidentally called Negro, right? Like he did never use colorblind language in any of his speeches, right? But what he did speak to is, we need to build a loving community where none of us have to erase our identities in order to get access to the things that we need to make us thrive. But when people say things like this, again, you can kind of get triggered by it, or you can realize, I just felt like it came up so many times, I kept thinking like, what is this? What's behind this? And it's that narrative of fear. This fear that if we actually move towards racial equity, what we'll get is a society of black supremacy. And I think many white people, regardless of where you stand in your, understandings or political leanings, do fear that if we have a system of racial equity, they hear black supremacy, which knowing what they know about white supremacy is a very scary thought, right? Then I also hear, what about rural white folks in Appalachia that are suffering too? Yes, they are. No one's saying they're not. We are, however, just talking about racial equity and what's going on with black folks. And I've been wondering to myself, what is with this insistence of hearing about one groups of people suffering and saying, I can't hear that. I need to remind you that I'm also suffering too. It's fear. It's fear that as we get into this work, that people will forget that there are real white folks in Appalachia who are also deeply suffering through their poverty, which is real. What we often don't talk about is how systemic racism is causing some of the suffering that they're dealing with, right? That if we eliminate racism, we can eliminate some of the pressures on rural white folks in Appalachia, but we'll talk about that a little later. And what I hear most often, I guess, because I also work a lot in schools, is I don't want my child to be discriminated against. And I often hear it from white parents. Again, without the acknowledgement that black children have been discriminated against since the dawn of this country, but okay, right? Because I am now a mother, which I love, it comes with a different visceral fear because I'm the mother of a black child and a black boy. I know in my body what that fear is when a white mother tells me this, right? So I get it. And the answer to dealing with these things is not to ignore that racial inequities exist. And the answer to this is not to fight towards racial equity. But, here I am, 4 years doing this work, consistently seeing this trend of people just being scared and believing that their fear of racial equity is actually coming from the things that black people are asking for. Without understanding that actually there's a narrative that we've been given as a nation and as a culture that's feeding into this cultural narrative of fear. Heather McGee wrote this book called The Sum of Us, which is amazing. You should read it if you have not. But one of the things that she identified really helped to open up my understanding of what's been going on with all these organizations. Also helped me understand why, when the going gets tough around work with racial equity, many white people, regardless of their intent, will start to pull back. And it has to do with this zero-sum story that we've been sold by our culture, which is in order for me to win, other people must lose, right? And it makes sense that most of us believe that, because for most of American history, that's actually kind of been true, right? Through the choices of our founding fathers, America's prosperity was extracted from the labor and the gifts of enslaved Africans, the genocide of Native Americans, the subjugation of people who were not labeled as white, and even for, some of the folks who were labeled as white, some of the ethnicities that are labeled as white here in 2022, were not always considered white, right? So let's think about Irish folks when they first came over from Eastern Europe, right? Or Italians as well. That whiteness label wasn't immediately put on them. And so as immigrants, they dealt with some of this experience of having their labor extracted in ways that were really cruel and harmful. And if you believe in this zero-sum story, that America can only be prosperous, we as a nation can only be prosperous if some of us are losing, then there's a logical extension to it. And Heather McGee says, the logical extension of the zero-sum story is that a future without racism is something white people should fear, because there will be nothing good for them in it, right? And it's hard to kind of see that right now. I don't know, maybe not for you, but it was for me. Because I sat there and thought, wow, I've been having this conversation about racial equity, assuming that we all understand that life will be better for us on the other side. What I didn't realize is actually, even like progressive white folks will engage in this work because they know morally it's right. But then when the going gets tough, they realize that they have no clue what they should hope for on the other end, right? I know that what I'm hoping for is, less likelihood that my black husband will be shot on his way to the store, less likelihood that my black son will be put into the school to prison pipeline, right? I'm hoping for, hopefully, maternal infant mortality outcome that would be better and on par with what white parents receive, white families experience. So there are all these visceral feelings in my body of like, why, of course, racial equity is the work to do. But what I didn't realize as I was doing this work is that most white people have not thought through what they stand to lose if we continue down this path. And you haven't thought through what you stand to gain if we continue to do this work. And it turns out empathy, nice feelings about loving the black people in your life, I was hoping that would be enough. But I think a lot has taught me over the last few years, and research has shown over the last few years that it's actually not. I would love to believe that doing all this work, with all the diversity trainings and getting you to empathize with people of color is going to be enough, but it's not. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? When I thought about the murders that occurred in Buffalo, that's an 18-year-old kid who's the murderer. Which means that there's also this idea that we were telling ourselves that racial inequity and the racial intolerance that we deal with as a country is an ancient idea, that it's aging out. And that if we just wait for some people with, weird ideas to just age out and pass away, then maybe we'll be better as a culture. And it's not true, because our youth are being indoctrinated into this system as we speak. Now here's what's fascinating. The research that Heather McGee looked at that actually showed that white people are holding the zero-sum story. They're holding this idea. You can actually pretty much consistently get white people to vote for more conservative, financially conservative, culturally conservative policies, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on. You can get them to vote for more conservative policies by reminding them that white people will no longer be in the majority by 2050. So studies have shown, you show a group of white people these articles about how America is going to shift over the next 20 to 30 years, and they will instinctively start voting for policies that are actually might not even be in their own best interest. Especially if you're a poor, working class, blue collar, white person, most of those policies are not in your best interest, but you will vote against the expansion of Medicaid. You will vote against universal health care. All people have to do is remind you that the country is going to be majority people of color by 2053. Now, what's fascinating about that research is it shows that African Americans don't believe the same thing. Black people, according to the research, actually believe that if we achieve racial equity, it will be better for all of us. So this idea that Black people are kind of sitting around like waiting for the day that we're on top, I mean, I can't lie, maybe sometimes I do that. I'm a human being. And when I think about the fullness of what's good for me and my country, it's not that. It's the concept of the love of community, right? And I actually believe that if things are better off for BIPOC folks, it'll be better for this country that I love just like myself. You know? But we have to address this zero-sum story because it's the unspoken truth that usually I don't hear from my clients until we've been doing a lot of work together. Right? They're like, oh, I trust you, I can tell you the thing. And the thing is usually like, I'm scared. I don't know if this organization will survive if we invest in racial equity. I don't know. So I'm thinking about this a lot. But how do I help y'all get through this barrier, right? I kind of want to put a little footnote here. We're in a world where I can get paid to talk to white people about white supremacy and how hard it is, right? And I think, God, if I have to tell my Haitian grandmother what I do for a living, she'd be like, what? People pay for that? And to a certain extent, right, that feels like a privilege. Isn't that great? But can you also think about the sheer absurdity that as a Black woman in this country dealing with these oppressions, it is now my job to teach you about this? Well, you know this. Why? So I have to put an asterisk in here and just kind of say, you're getting a different Marsha today, you know, something about domestic terror in a northeastern state might have triggered this a little bit. So you're getting a different Marsha today who's sitting here and kind of having this weird meta experience of, I love doing these talks, I love doing this education, and can you think about the sheer absurdity of this country in terms of the dynamic it has set up between all of us? That somehow the person who experiences the oppression is the one who has to come in and be paid to tell you about the oppression. And that's only because I really these days I insist on being paid. People used to ask me to do it for free all the time, right? And so I know that's a hard, I just want to lift the veil a little bit about the ways in which some of the white supremacist ideology that exists in our culture leads to these really absurd interactions between people in different positions in our country. That actually wouldn't make sense if you really thought it through, but we have to do this work together, otherwise we're not going to get through. And here's the work I want you to kind of start to engage in right now. And here's some strategies for pushing forward. Because I felt for it to myself, how do I, as a Black woman in this country, continue to do this racial equity work and not just curl into a ball in the corner and cry, right? And here are the two things that I really try to get clear on to help me push forward. One, I get clear on what white supremacy has personally cost me. And I'm asking white people who are engaging in this work, get clear on what white supremacy has personally cost you. So that when we get into the moments where it's really hard to push forward with this racial equity work, you know, yes, oh my gosh, I know that my work's pushing back and that's so scary. But I can't just acquiesce to that because I know what it costs us to not engage in this work even further. And then to also get clear on what you'll gain through racial equity. I find that most organizations I work with, most people I work with, don't know what the answer to that is. You're like, okay, so why are you doing this work on racial equity? And they're like, well, because I know it's right, which is true. And what are you going to get when you get to the other side? And usually, because you can't answer that question, it's really, really hard to get through the hard moments. And there will be hard moments, right? This work is hard, it's long, it's messy. You'll find yourself getting into these complicated conversations. You don't know how you got there, you don't know how to get out. But if you go through it understanding what your bigger picture is, you'll be able to make it through. So, yes, I have in mind some financial data to kind of give you, to help you kind of get clear on what you gain through racial equity. But I want you to kind of think of this question a little bit yourself first. Take a minute. Think through, what does white supremacy cost you personally? Now take a moment and turn to the person next to you. Say at least hello and what your name is if you haven't already done that. And then say, hey, I think white supremacy has cost me this. All right? Let's take a couple minutes. Share your answers.
Yeah, cool. I'm Sarah. I can go first. I think that what white supremacy is the ability to show up for opportunity for people of color at times, because thinking the assumption I think in some ways color has more
Take about 10 more seconds to the conversation.
holding me back. That's very good, very good. Like, I was struggling to give an answer, but that's very good. I think that's a struggle about being, and so making sure you're not like wanting to be just be casual if you do this, but not overthink.
All right, so next to the whole group. You know, usually my workshops, I don't spend a lot of time like letting white folks kind of share about what racism is like in their experience, right? Because sometimes it gets, like, words come out that may feel triggering, so if you're a BIPOC person who's heard some of that, please take care of yourself and breathe if you need to, and I'm totally happy for you to leave, you know, as part of that process. But part of the reason I'm naming it is because these are the conversations that we need to have for real, so that you can move forward. Because I will tell you that, like, a lot of the trainings that I would say even I have led have kept us at the 101 level, where you get to do that thing over and over again, where you're like, let's define diversity again, and white supremacy again, and then you just never move forward. But like, I wanted to leave a minute for us to have this very real conversation that there is actually, not just for me, I'm hoping, we all have some idea of what white supremacy costs people of color. By this point, you should have some idea, right? But you all don't talk enough about what it's costing you. We talk a lot about white privilege, and we don't talk about the cost that privilege comes at, right? There's an emotional and a relational toll that already came up in this conversation. The emotional toll of not being able to form authentic relationships, of thinking that black woman is your buddy and realizing that you're only her work friend, right? There's a reason certain levels of intimacy are not easy to come by in interracial friendships or relationships, regardless of how much you two love each other. It takes a while to get to the point of being able to say, this is my experience as a black person. And then for you to say, this is my experience as a white person. And that level of vulnerability is required for true intimacy, but it's so hard to get at because of white supremacy. This system in place that's been telling us that we cannot be together because there's something not just financially at risk, almost physically at risk, right? If you do that, there's a toll. There's a moral and spiritual toll. There's a financial and political toll. And I really, again, I was really planning to come here, talk about ONtrac, about the financial toll, but again, you know, for what it's worth, you know, white supremacy is reared its head in a certain way that I now have to switch things up a little bit, because I'd be remiss in light of that mass murder to not speak to some of the moral and spiritual costs. Y'all look at their faces. And these are the faces that we have pictures of, right? I mean, if I was going to show you pictures of every black person that was lost to white terrorism, there would not be space or time. But here are the faces of Roberta Drury, Marcus Morrison, Andre McNeil, Aaron Salter, Geraldine Talley, Celestine Cheney, Hayward Patterson, Catherine Massey, Pearl Young and Ruth Whitfield. They were murdered during a Saturday afternoon grocery trip in Buffalo, New York, by a white supremacist gunman. And this slide represents the murderer. I don't want to give him a platform or notoriety by sharing his name or his picture. But what's important to know for the sake of our conversation is that he was an 18-year-old high school honor student who became radicalized within the last year, right? And in his his ranting document, he said, "Did my parents talk to me about race? No, they didn't. They never talked to me about it at all." So where he learned about race was on the internet. And we all know how accurate a resource that is, right? So while you're not talking to your children about race, this kid is learning everything he can from 4chan, right? And for me, one of the interesting things that emerged this week is I was deep in grief that felt very familiar for the Black lives that were lost. And then this little thing was coming in to me, and I don't know if it was because he was an 18-year-old, but I used to be a high school teacher, and in my mind I was like, oh my God, what if that was one of my kids? And knowing what I know about teaching high school students, I've seen the seeds of the violence that this kid has enacted. I've seen it in my white students. Whether or not you know it, they're having these conversations. And I thought to myself, like, I have to go through a grieving process for him too. Because he's still alive, but I can't imagine what the spiritual and moral toll is to be 18 and have already killed 10 people in the span of an hour. And as someone who has taught kids, and all my kids always feel like my babies, I felt like I lost another baby then too. And we often want to talk about this guy as though he's a lone actor, right? And to do that would be to ignore America's long, systemic use of violence to maintain white supremacy. He's not a lone actor. He's actually doing what generations of white men have done for a very long time, right? I mean, he enacted a public lynching. If he were, who did this like 20 to 30, 40 years ago, there might have been postcards of it that people would sell, right? Because that's what folks did with lynchings in the past. Take a picture next to a dead black body. That's what was happening at picnics, right? That's the culture that we've emerged out of. If you were surprised to hear that, it's because you don't know your own history, right? And we're in a moment of time where people are actively advocating for you not learning your own history, as though that will keep you safe. But here's another cost of white supremacy, the cost, because them wanting to take the history away, it's actually cyclical. That happens in a systemic way. If you knew history, you'd be prepared for it. If you knew history, you'd be prepared for the white lash that's coming. And I say coming, right? The murder we saw last week is the beginning of, we're in the beginning stages of, the white lash that is coming. I know this because I know history. There was a white lash after slaves were freed. There was Reconstruction, and we got large amounts of businesses and thriving Black communities that were all taken down by white violence. These things are predictable. But you can't save your child from it unless you teach him that it's coming. This kid was not prepared for the seduction of white supremacy that comes from 4chan because his parents didn't talk to him about it. And no one told him, here are the costs of white supremacy. Hey son, if you go down this way, I know it feels like it might be a good outlet for your rage, but then it leads to a level of rage that you cannot contain. And then it doesn't just take you out, it takes other people out. But no one told him this, so then he gets seduced, right? And so when we talk about the cost of white supremacy, I think most Black people know that the cost is our children, and the cost is us. But what I'm realizing, and the question becomes for white people, is how many more of your children are you willing to sacrifice at the altar of white supremacy? I mean, these are your kids doing these acts. I would say from the perspective of a griever, losing someone is really, really hard. Losing someone to this kind of violence is incredibly hard. I don't want to minimize that. But I'll also say I don't know what someone has to go through when you know that it's your kid that did that. And to know that you're part of a legacy of people who do that, right? And how do you, what's the emotional moral toll of that? Aren't you tired of this process? I mean, we often talk about Black people being like, Black Lives Matter, and we're tired of being killed. We are. But we've been surviving, white people, for 400 years. We have our processes, we have our systems. It's not ideal. I want you to stop killing us now, but we have a process for dealing with this. What's your process for ensuring that this no longer happens? You gotta figure it out. The weight is not on Black people to figure out how to get you to be less violent. Not just in action, but in word, in policy, and how you run your organization. It's 2022, guys, jig is up. You have to decide you're tired of this and that you're ready to move forward. I hope that in this moment, you're making some kind of commitment where you're telling yourself, I'm ready, or I'm no longer ready to lose any more children to this system. But here's the thing, there's also a political cost to this. Heather McGee, in that same book that I referenced earlier, she says the United States of America has had the world's largest economy for most of our history, with enough money to feed and educate all of our children, build world-leading infrastructure, and generally ensure a high standard of living for everyone. But we don't. When it comes to per capita government spending, the United States is near the bottom of the list of industrialized countries, below Latvia and Estonia. Part of the reason that is one of the most effective ways to get white voters to vote against their own best interests on either side of the aisle is to imply that the policy will somehow benefit Black people and others who are painted as undeserving. So you talk about welfare queens and dangerous immigrants, and that convinces white voters on both sides to vote against policies like expanding Medicare, universal health care, that would positively impact life for rural or working class and middle class Americans. This is actually a strategy that has been known as the Southern strategy that was used in the process of Nixon campaigning for his presidential spot. It's a well-documented strategy, right? If you want to get poor and working class people to vote to lower taxes, let them know that their tax money goes to undeserving Black people, which is silly, because yeah, some of it goes to it, but y'all know you're the majority of the country, right? So like any policy that we enact that's going to provide a social safety net, will provide a social safety net for you. So if you're in a system, especially if you're wondering, like you're probably just somebody that you care about, I'm assuming, right? If you're connected with ONtrac, it's because you have a deep heart for community in some ways, kind of linking up finances and community. And we do have an incredible issue with poverty, not just poverty for Black folks, but for white folks in this area. And if you're finding it really hard to get anyone to care about passing policies that will help rural white folks, part of the reason you're finding it hard is because anytime you propose a policy, someone will say, but won't that mean that Black people might get some stuff? Or that immigrants might get some things? And then they vote against it. So systemic racism has been used pretty consistently to make sure that we do not pass policies that would actually benefit the majority of this country. So that's what it's costing you as well, right? Okay, now I'm ready, because I'm ready to get into what we gained. Oh. Heather McGee calls it the solidarity dividend, right? She's trying to propose that we have something else that we think of instead of the zero-sum story. And she's calling it the solidarity dividend. What we get by investing in racial equity and allowing these interracial coalitions to build and build strength. That's some of the context for this, I have to say, is I have to bring back a kind of depressing map, which is, here's the growing racial gap, wealth gap, I'm sorry. between Black, Latino, and white household wealth. And I actually presented this when we did this in 2019. If you go follow this trend until 2053, the median income for Black families will be 0. Or median wealth. And we tell this story often focusing on what's going on with the Black and Latino families, but we don't talk about how this actually also impacts white families. Yeah, it looks great that you're all the way up here, but the reality of the situation is, again, in comparison to other industrialized nations, we're not spending as much per person, which actually has some implications in the long run. Also, as the world becomes more diverse, and we have a more diverse country, if our businesses continue in this way, of this kind of pandering to racially inequitable systems, they're going to lose out in the long run. Here's what you can gain by investing in racial equity. McKinsey did a study, not just within the US, but also in other predominantly white countries. And they realized that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 30% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So it's financially lucrative to invest in racial and ethnic diversity from a business perspective. In the United States, there's actually a linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance, especially if you increase the amount of diversity on your senior executive team. So that means senior executive team where the decisions are being made, right? So if you actually diversify and make sure that you're sharing decision-making power with people who are impacted by these systems of oppression, you actually increase the earnings of your company. In part because diversity of views, not everyone's thinking the same way. You can check each other's blind spots. You can think about, how do we go into communities that we haven't been in before? What's the language that we use? So there's a financial incentive for diversity, for racial equity efforts. And, I'll put in also another footnote as a town that's really interested in tourism. Towns that are more diverse are able to attract more businesses, right? You're able to attract more businesses, you're able to make a more thriving middle class. So investing in racial equity actually not just helps individual businesses, but also it helps the town itself, especially if you're thinking about a town like ours that's focused on focused on tourism. People want to come to towns that have a thriving, diverse, and interesting cultural scene. You can only have that if you actually remove barriers to racial equity and allow people to thrive in this town. Kellogg Foundation did a beautiful study on the benefits of racial equity on multiple sectors and what we could gain by investing in it. And their estimate is we get an estimated increase of $2.3 trillion in our US economy by 2050 if the educational achievement of Black and Hispanic Latino children was raised to that of white children, according to one study. Now, I want to edit this language a little bit, because they're saying, let's raise the educational achievement of Black and Hispanic Latino children. That was the language that the study used. But we have to keep in mind that the educational achievement of those children is not, we're focusing on the individual when we use the language in this way, right? We're not saying that, oh wow, if Black and Hispanic Latino children just did better in school, we would actually have a better economy. It's important to recognize that the achievement gap, what we call the achievement gap, is actually more adequately called an opportunity gap, right? That if we actually had educational institutions that were giving people the opportunity they needed to live into their full potential, we could move beyond this. And we could actually get a financial gain from it as well. Here's an example. Ashland City Schools. In 2017, their total enrollment, it's kind of hard to see the print, but here's the white population here. White students make up about 63% of the population. I'm just going to focus on white and Black right now, but I know for the sake of time, but know that there's other numbers here clearly. Black students make up about 21% of the population, but in terms of in-school suspensions, Black students make up 60% of in-school suspensions, and white students make up 23%. old narratives about race would tell us to make a story that, oh, well, the black kids are just more unruly. And if we taught the black kids how to be less unruly, we wouldn't have to suspend them as much, right? That's usually a story we tell. Research does not bear that out, right? The data actually bears out that black students get suspended at higher rates for the same infractions that white students do. So that mostly this number, I mean, this trend is not just in national city schools. This trend, you can see it at any school district across the country. It's pretty much the same. And that what's actually happening, and studies have shown, is that there are institutional biases that are emerging that lead to these numbers. That a black kid could be acting exactly the same as a white kid in the same classroom, and the teacher will most likely suspend the black child and not the white child. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter the race of the teacher. So, personal story. In my classroom, this is actually part of how I decided to get into the racial equity work. I looked at the numbers in my classroom of kids who were passing or passing the state exams and the suspension rates. My classroom also had a racial disparity, right? My reasoning was a little different. I was telling myself this story of, well, I gotta discipline you before the world does. It was more important for me to be like, look, we gotta teach you how to stay in line because this system will take you down. And what I didn't realize was here I was training my students, or training myself to be an arm of this white supremacist system, right? It makes me think back to Leslie, right? Of the ways in which we are all teaching ourselves to keep our kids in line, keep our kids in line, right? So how do you deal with this? Turns out, you can actually address this with something called restorative justice. Right? Restorative justice circles are a way of actually allowing kids to work out their problems in a way that actually increases their social and emotional skills. They come up with reasonable solutions to a problem. They find ways to solve a problem that don't involve suspension at all because that suspension process is fraught with inequities. Beautiful thing is that districts that have implemented restorative justice have seen the numbers of in-school suspensions go down. And here's the thing, it's not just good for black kids, because it also goes down for everyone in this circle. Because what we often don't talk about is, yeah, race comes up. But the white kids who are most vulnerable in this system, they also get taken down by these suspension systems, right? And so here's another way of the solidarity dividend coming into play. If you take out, the old kind of carceral punishment-based system that's fraught with racial inequities, you bring in restorative justice, you lower these suspension rates for everyone. For everyone, right? Now, I want to give a shout out here to the United Way that is funding restorative justice practices emerging in the Asheville City Schools today. So they are currently engaging in these processes. I don't have current data for Asheville City Schools, but if what happens in our district is anything like any other district that has expanded this widespread, this is a beautiful thing for all of our students, right? Let's talk about health. We get $230 billion projected economic aid per year if health disparities are eliminated by 2050. So think about Buffalo County, where black people are 3 times more likely to die from diabetes than white people. Diabetes is a very treatable disease. But if we figure this out, it would be really interesting. And I mean, there are tons of finance people in the room. I'm going to give you a project. Maybe let's calculate what this might be for our locale. What do we gain per year if we eliminate those health disparities? Employment and entrepreneurship. If we eliminated racial disparities in employment and entrepreneurship, here's what we gain. There's $800 billion additional annual consumer spending. Because all of those, all the white pop people who've been systemically left out of opportunity in this country still live in this country, right? So if you make sure that we all can thrive, what will we do? We will buy things like every other American. Because it turns out we're just human, just like you. Right? Give us that money, we'll bring it back into the economy. If we could get 9 million potential jobs created by businesses owned by people of color, if ownership rates were comparable to white rates. More jobs. $450 billion in additional annual federal tax revenue. Annually. $100 billion in additional annual state and local tax revenue. Sometimes I like to think this is what we're losing every year by not investing in racial equity. So when your city says things like, we cannot afford to do this, and we should cut down some schools. I don't know what you're going to do, right? But you know, if your city says that, you can ask them things like, how much are we investing in racial equity? And I will say in the city, some, right? So there are some really great initiatives that are occurring. And we're leaving some money on the table. So even if you don't care at all about Black people, I mean, I'm hoping your American capitalistic need to keep making money will help you realize that you're missing out. Yeah? So here's, I think the point I'd like us to leave with is that this whole concept of us investing in racial equity is not just something we do for Black people. You're not coming in to save us, right? There's a beautiful quote by Lila Watson. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. My hope is that what you'll take away from this talk is the idea that if we continue to systemically oppress 1/9 of our population, that you lose out to. You can't be liberated because you're part of a system that is systemically oppressing someone else and telling you that their subjugation is what you need to thrive. But that's not true. Just remember your liberation is bound up with mine. And on that, I'll let you go to lunch.